Good evening, I'm Cathy Lewis, and here's what matters this week. There is a new statue on Capitol Square in Richmond, and thousands of people braved 90-degree-plus temperatures to be there at its recent unveiling. It commemorates an improbable revolution led by a 16-year-old girl in Farmville, Virginia. Lisa Godley was in Richmond for the dedication, and she reports that what is commemorated in stone is just one chapter in a long and painful story.
Hundreds, spanning several generations, recently gathered on the grounds of the state capitol in Richmond to witness a day that some thought they'd never see.
I know in my mind that we wouldn't have anything like this. I didn't even think anything could be contemplated, but to come here and see it, it's a godsend.
Now on the grounds of the Virginia State Capitol, along with others who made their mark on Virginia history, is a memorial saluting those courageous students who helped break down those walls of segregation and massive resistance. Thousands of school children who visit the state capitol each year will now see 16-year-old Barbara Johns and her classmates. On April 23rd of 1951, Johns led a walkout and demonstration at Robert Russa Moton High School in Farmville, Virginia, to protest the intolerable conditions at the school. 450 students followed Johns out of those doors. LaVon Fryer was one of them.
We sit in tar paper shacks, and I can remember sitting there with an umbrella in my left hand, trying to write with my right hand, because when it rained, it leaked in the place.
Fryer says the tar paper shacks were cold and the bathrooms were outside. It would take another 3 years before the Supreme Court would strike down separate but equal. But this was only the beginning of the long struggle against massive resistance. Almost 8 years after Barbara Johns and her classmates in Farmville took their courageous stand, members of the Norfolk 17 made history here by becoming the first students to integrate previously all-white schools here in Norfolk, including Norview High School, where Patricia Godbolt and 6 others attended. A cross was burned on Godbolt's front lawn even as she prepared to take the test to determine if she was qualified to attend an all-white school. She persevered and passed the test with flying colors, but acceptance would not come easy.
But when I walked up to the building, the perimeter was covered with reporters and students hanging out, and I didn't really feel fear then. I didn't feel fear until it was time to come out of the building. I was sitting there thinking, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? So now I have to walk home.
She says she was glad to see a friendly face who ushered her to a car, but they were followed by a car full of white men.
So the driver of my car started going all through Coronado and back up Widgeon Road. And when we got to Widgeon Road, and right down the corner of Widgeon Road, there was a car parked there. Driver of my car nodded to the driver of that car, and they intercepted the drivers of the other car.
Godbolt would go on to graduate from Norview High School, but she says there wasn't a day her mother didn't fear for her life.
It's hard to think about your child coming to school every day and not knowing whether that child's going to come back in a body bag or not.
Like Barbara Johns, Patricia Godbolt and many others endured a great deal of pain and suffering to change the course of history. So, in recognition of the students and the civil rights attorneys who led the way, and those who will continue to carry the torch, there's a statue that not only symbolizes the contributions made by African Americans, but by women and children, all who said enough and dared to make a difference. For What Matters, I'm Lisa Godley.
That 1951 action in Farmville was one of 5 cases that eventually came together to be known as Brown versus the Board of Education. And in 1954, as Lisa said, the Supreme Court struck down the concept of separate but equal education. And while the concept may have been dead, the ideology behind it was very much alive. In Norfolk, 17 young men and women were encouraged to become the first African Americans to integrate all-white Norfolk schools, one of them Norview, as you saw in Lisa's report. But that was fully 4 years after the Supreme Court decision. And tonight, nearly 50 years later, we will talk with two members of the Norfolk 17. Andrew Heidelberg has just published a new book about his experience that he is shopping as a screenplay as well. He was a student and a football player and in the era of massive resistance. Dolores Johnson Brown also will share her experiences with us during that very turbulent time. Charles Ford chairs the history department at Norfolk State University, where much of the scholarship and much of the documentary evidence of massive resistance has been undertaken. And Ellis James's family played a significant role in the desegregation movement as well. Good to have all of you with us tonight.
Good to be here.
You know, I tell you, it's hard to imagine, Andy Heidelberg, that it's been almost 50 years.
Yes, it is. I mean, you think about it. You wake up one morning and you wonder, where has the time gone?
Boy, no kidding.
You look around and see all of the things that are happening there that could not even be contemplated in the days that we were there. And you have to understand that things have changed, even though, you know, we got a long way to go, but things have changed materially.
So Dolores Johnson Brown, what in your view has changed since that time? We'll talk a bit in a moment about what that experience was like, and we'll sort of connect those years between 54 and 58, 59, but what has changed as you've seen
I'd
it?
like to tell you what changed between going to Booker T. Washington High School back in those days, which was the only African-American school in the city of Norfolk, as compared to going to Norview Senior High School, okay? Now, at Booker T, when we took physical education, we had to take cold showers because there was no hot water, okay?
And you did that your freshman and sophomore freshman year, right? Yeah.
Right, absolutely. And also the books. The books. We always had used books, dirty books, books that had been written in the answers or whatever the questions. You had to kind of figure out what the question was asking because part of the words were not there. So it's a tremendous difference from way back then, 50 years ago, as compared to how it is today.
And your experience is so interesting because as a freshman, you went to Booker T, all-black high school, right?
Absolutely.
Then your sister, who lived in New Jersey, needed some help with her children, so you went to an integrated school in New Jersey, is that right?
Yes, West Orange High School, and I'll never forget it. One of my best friends was named Judy Gaynor. We would even go to the movies together on Saturday. That's how welcome I was made.
Really?
At West Orange High School. I will never forget it as long as I live. And I just knew that Norview would be the same way.
So black children and white children, you figure it's not a problem, right?
No problem. I'm happy to be. I'll be able to walk to school now. I won't have to get up real early in the morning and get on that bus to go downtown to Booker T. Washington High School.
So you come back for your junior year thinking, piece of cake. You've done this. This won't be a problem. This won't be what everybody's saying it's going to be a big problem, right?
I think that may have had something to do why I was selected as one of the 17, because one of the school board members asked me, so, well, what are you going to do if they call you the N-word? You know, of course, he said the word back in those days. But I said, that won't bother me because when I was going to school at West Orange High School, nobody called me that word. I don't think they'll call me that word. And if they do, I'll just ignore them.
So you, I'm just trying to picture this innocent little child walking into this as a junior.
Yes. Oh, my.
So the first day?
I walk up the aisle, I get out of the car, and I walk up the aisle. Here are all these policemen. I'll never forget, they had on big, tall, black boots. They had, looked like, to me, shotguns. I don't know what to call those long guns, but they were big guns. They had big hats on, and people were throwing things at me, sticks and rocks and paper, and I'm thinking, in a minute now, the policeman's going to come over and protect me and say, stop, stop, don't do that. That never happened. All the way into the school. That's what it was. My first day at Norview. I'll never forget as long as I live.
And we noted in the report that Lisa did, there were 6 other students there, among them Andrew Heidelberg, but you never saw any of the other ones.
I never saw any of them. Changing classes, I thought, sure, I kept looking around. I never saw any of them. And one day, when I was changing classes, here comes this real short little boy, runs up to me, knocks my books out of my hands, and I'm busy trying to pick up all my books, and I look on the back of my hand, and there's blood. Blood. He actually cut me. I don't know whether it was a razor blade or what it was, but I quickly, it wasn't real deep, thank God, and I hurried on my way to my next class. I could never go to the restroom. I had to hold it all day long. You don't dare go into the bathroom. No way.
It's an extraordinary experience, and you were a junior. Andrew Heidelberg, you were a freshman coming into this. Yes. And so what was your experience like?
I kind of went into it thinking that I was going to have trouble because as a young man, you know, like we lived near Sewell's Point Road, which was the only road that took you from, say, when the whites came from Ocean View and Little Creek to Northview High School. So they came through there frequently. Yeah. Now, whenever they got into that area, you would easily hear somebody either throw some urine out the window, say, hey, niggas, get out the road, or whatever. I mean, they always said something. So I was always in the act of either throwing rocks at them when they came by or calling them names the same way. So the first thing came to my mind when I was talking to one of my friends, I said, I know they're going to kill me. I know they're going to kill me.
And you had to be selected for this.
Right.
I mean, you were chosen from you had to sort of apply for this and be accepted for this, and your lovely father is with us in the studio, and I just can't imagine what that must have been like to go to your father and say, we want your son to be one of these 17 young people who will do this.
Well, what happened really was that they came to our house, and they were asking my father, they were talking to my mother and father when I came in that evening, and so my mother gave me the option, says, ask him. So they asked me, and as I put in the book, which is a true story, I was supposed to be home at 5:30, and it was like about 20 minutes, a quarter to 6. So I'm late. So I'm running, flying, trying to get there because my dad...
You're just worried about being late.
Yes, because my dad would like tear your butt up, you know. And so when they asked me...
He might do it today because he's sitting right here in the studio with us.
When I got there and they asked me the question, was like, whatever's going to make my dad and mother take their mind off it, I'll see it. And I said, oh, sure, I'll be glad to go. But in my mind, really, no, it wasn't that I didn't want to go. I said, we're not going to go. You know, black kids and white kids don't go to school
together. So you figured you would say yes, get out of whatever punishment was going to, and it wouldn't happen.
And it wouldn't happen.
No problem.
It wouldn't happen. And when it was actually September time to go, and the NAACP said, get ready, and we got ready. And then they said, nope, wait a minute, it's closed. I said, see, I told you.
Told you it wasn't going to happen.
Told you it wasn't going to happen. And that's exactly the way I felt about it.
Oh, my goodness. It was a while before you actually got to school.
Yeah.
And that was because of something called massive resistance. By the way, Andrew Heidelberg has a great new book out called The Norfolk 17, a personal narrative on desegregation in Norfolk, Virginia, 1958 through 1962. And I understand that you just finished, literally this very morning, a screenplay about this.
Yes, about it.
So maybe we'll see this on the big screen.
Oh, you're going to see it. You're going to see it.
One way or the other. Well, just give us a sense, Dr. Ford, about the timing here, because you've got the Brown versus Board of Education comes down 54 says separate but equal, no more. You kind of think when the Supreme Court says something, that's what's going to happen, but that wasn't
initially,
the case.
The school board seemed to give lip service to compliance, but really they didn't want to at all. In 1955, the City Council and the school board put forth a freedom of choice plan that allowed parents to enroll their students in the schools of their choice. But the idea was the school of their choice would be the segregated school in their own neighborhood.
That was the hope of the board at the time.
That was the hope. Yeah. And then, of course, the governor Stanley at the time, and then Senator Harry Byrd, definitely didn't want any kind of compliance at all, even lip service.
So they figured they could stall it?
They could stall it, or they could do something even more defiant, which was massive resistance, much more in your face, which was not the way of Norfolk's white officialdom, except for its mayor, Fred Duckworth. The rest wanted much more passive resistance.
So massive resistance meant what? Close the schools?
Close the schools, exactly.
And just don't comply?
And don't comply.
Yeah.
And that was the charge that Senator Byrd and the governor came up with in 1956. Now, in the meantime, the NAACP and school children, African-American school children and parents in Norfolk went to court. In April and May 1956, Victor Ashe and J. Hooker Madison filed suit in Judge Hoffman's courtroom, Judge Walter Hoffman. And Judge Hoffman would rule that in February of 1957 that the schools had to be desegregated, had to come up with a plan. And the school board delayed and delayed and delayed, and that pushed it back beyond the 57-58 school year to the 58-59 school year.
When the delay
And
time
the delay
clock runs out. And
had
you,
to run out, exactly.
Very, very interesting. And the other fascinating part of this, and you'd have to really have an appreciation, which is I think part of what we're trying to do, for what the society was like at that time in this region.
Well, Norfolk had a particularly progressive, self-improving image of itself. It was run by businessmen who had business sense, and yet they closed their schools. It seemed quite incongruous, I mean, very paradoxical, but the whole idea was to manage white supremacy. So you had the sort of nicer version of that, led by Pretlow Darden, and then Fred Duckworth, the in-your-face Cavalier Ford auto salesman, who again would come out with a much more explicit racism. There were two sides of one coin, which was to maintain white supremacy and segregation.
And yet at the same time, the lesser told part of this story is that there were, at the same time that there were African American people pressing through the courts and doing the work that they were doing, there was a group of white people doing the same thing. And I guess because of the time, they really could not work together or did not work together.
Well,
which is it?
They chose politically to remain all white because they didn't want to alienate those moderates in the middle, that mushy middle. They wanted to appeal to as many whites as possible.
So politically a very tenuous thing, but Ellis James's father was among those who was in that group of white people who filed suit and pressed this issue. Ellis James, how many were in that group?
There were about 6,000 people who joined the Norfolk Public Schools Committee. And they were people, many of them very committed to being fair and to seek equal justice. They were unwilling to see the destruction of the public school system, knowing full well that it would destroy the community, both black and white. And one of the things that we've touched on already is you have to keep in mind, during this period of time, we were still totally segregated. Right up until 1965.
So these 6,000 people in this group, were they all on the side of fighting injustice, or were some of them involved in it from, I hope you'll pardon this, a more practical or a more political perspective that said, look, we've just got to get things moving again. We've got to get these schools open?
I think you have to remember that there were all points of view and all points of the compass involved. There were a great many people who were very well grounded. For instance, in my family, on my mother's father's side, we had Quakers. On my mother's side, we had practically the equivalent of FFV people who were dyed-in-the-wool segregationists.
So lots of different perspectives under that tent.
And so you had a very large tent, and you had the same kind of spectrum involved with the Norfolk Committee for Public Schools.
And you had that same spectrum with African-American opinion in the
Absolutely.
city. You had Eugene Brown, Reverend Eugene Brown, who was a devoted supporter of Mayor Duckworth and tried to have some kind of peace deal without the litigation, the unpleasantness.
Really?
You also had in the middle P.B. Young, the very conservative but still very insistent on rights editor of the Journal and Guide, who approached the City Council in 1958 with a biracial commission that would implement the Brown decision. That was seen as a sellout by the Baptist ministers and also by lawyer Edward Dawley and Len Holt, who were very, very radical and were harassed for their radicalism by the state.
So against this whole political backdrop where we see all of these fascinating points of view sort of under this 1 or 2 or 3 tenths, depending on how you look at it, Andrew Heidelberg, they have discovered that you can play some football.
Let me just add up one point though first, because I think that a lot of people don't understand what we went through from some of the people in the black community, because there were a lot of blacks who looked at us and said, why do y'all want to start trouble like that? Why don't you just learn how to stay in your place? I mean, there was a lot of them.
So it wasn't
like
as
that.
if there was complete support
believe
for
me,
what you were doing.
believe me,
Yeah.
it carried me back to like slavery, when some people say we were better off with being a slave than we are with freedom. I mean, so it was
very complex.
Yes.
And here, I think this is a picture of your football team. So you were playing for Norview. They discovered you can play football. Did that help you?
Well, let's back up. I went out for the team first in my junior year, and I really should have played. I know I was good enough to play, but they cut me from the team based, I think, on the fact that I was just a black kid in the times. But in my last year, I went out again, and that was what made my story different from the rest of the kids, because that was actually one of the greatest years in my life. I just
even though when you went on the road, I remember you telling a story about you had to
that was
separately.
Yes, I was. Now we went to Prince Edward County. Now, don't forget.
Oh, right, Prince Edward County,
Prince Edward County, where the schools were closed for 5 years.
But I think you need to remember that even here, we had coaches in schools that did not want to play and would not play if the team had a black member.
Right.
Yeah, it's such a different
Oscar
time.
Smith didn't play us because we had blacks in the school. There was no blacks on the team. They canceled the game and took the loss.
Wow.
Yeah, their superintendent, William Story, was a defender of state sovereignty, which was the most arch segregationist out there.
It is amazing. And so at the same time, you endured this gauntlet every day of going into school.
Yes.
There were, we should note, not every white child in the school was opposed to your being there, and some of them tried to be nice and talk to you, and that didn't go so well for some of them.
Oh, a lot of us. It didn't go well for me either. There, in 2.5 years before I played football, believe me, I could not count 3 people.
Yeah.
3 people in a school of 2,400.
And there is no comparison to what these members of the Norfolk 17 went through, but it is true that many white people in the community, the group that was trying to fight this issue, were having their own social consequences as well.
Oh, absolutely. My sister Penny was subjected to a great deal of harassment. She was ostracized, and she wasn't the only one. Remember now that the James et al. Versus Duckworth and versus Allman cases were 16 families.
Right.
Okay,
so all of you had that.
So we all had, to some extent, those kinds of experiences. I made a point of talking to my sister before this presentation to get a feel for her recollections, and she confirmed that there were problems that were very, very striking.
He had an interesting question too when he asked me, do you know who was disliked more, just as much or more than the blacks at that particular time? And I, after he said it, I thought about the young man that used to speak to me during my 4th bell class, and they had beat him up, and I never saw him again. They really beat him terribly.
Well, tough times, and that story and many more are told in Andrew Heidelberg's new book, The Norfolk 17, A Personal Narrative on Desegregation. Thanks to all of you for being with us today, and we look forward in this year coming up to telling these stories in greater detail, and especially to seeing some of the work that Norfolk State will be doing in this regard, where so much of this is housed. I'll be back in a moment with a final thought. This week's show was well in hand when we learned Thursday of the death of Hugo Owens Sr. Educated in segregated Portsmouth and Norfolk County, what we now know as Chesapeake, Dr. Owens set up a dental practice in 1947, and he didn't quit for 44 years. But he did so much more to change the world around him, one that was very sharply divided along racial lines, as we've been learning tonight. In the same year that Barbara Johns walked out of Moton High, Hugo Owens walked into court, suing to desegregate Portsmouth's City Park, its golf course, and later Portsmouth General Hospital. In 1970, he was one of the first 2 African Americans elected to Chesapeake City Council. 2 years later, he led a 4-person integrated ticket, was reelected, and served as vice mayor for 8 years. The Virginian pilot's Denise Watson-Batts reports that he described himself as just an old broke-down dentist, but that was really humility talking. In his 80s, he spent a good deal of time at the Chesapeake Middle School that's named in his honor. But his son said that at the age of 92, he just hadn't been the same since the April death of his wife of 66 years. When asked about his activism, Dr. Owens said people would say that they didn't have time to get involved. It's that they didn't have that spine in their backs to challenge. May we all strengthen our own spines to challenge the injustices that diminish us all. And now a look at what matters to you. Our recent program on the new Proton Therapy Center coming to Hampton University inspired this email from Linda Staling. What an informative program. This is an awesome eye-opener for the many people who have never heard of proton therapy. The Ralston story of Jake's cancer is a tribute to the success of Proton and hopefully a catalyst to making the much-needed Hampton Center a reality. And our program about proton therapy also brought this email from Barb Carell. Thanks for your show about proton therapy. Having personally been diagnosed as a child with a potential brain tumor, this brings the incredible beauty of this new treatment center home. We're privileged to have this facility being constructed in our area. I feel certain individuals would gladly donate to this cause in memory of their loved ones or for the benefit of future victims of cancer. Thanks for the show. And thank you for joining us for this edition of What Matters. We'll be back next week.